The advertisement did not mention the silence. It spoke about fertile land in Montana Territory, about a modest farm west of Helena, about honest work, clean mountain air, and a widowed farmer seeking a respectable woman, willing to build a quiet life beside him. The handwriting had been careful, educated enough to calm Eleanor Whitmore the first night she read it in her boarding room in Boston. Samuel Reed, farmer, widower, no children living, a God-fearing man, seeking companionship in a peaceful home. Nothing in the letter warned her about the winter. Nothing warned her about the loneliness that waited inside that cabin. And nothing warned Samuel Reed that the woman stepping off that train would know more about poetry than bread. The train rolled slowly through the Montana snow in January of 1887, its iron wheels shrieking against frozen tracks, while Eleanor sat stiffly beside the window, with gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Beyond the glass stretched endless white hills and dark pine trees bent beneath heavy snow. Smoke drifted across the pale sky from distant chimneys, scattered far apart like forgotten memories. She had imagined the West differently, warmer somehow, not in temperature, in spirit. Back in Boston, the word farmer had painted a certain picture in her mind. A gentleman with roughened hands, perhaps, but still polished around the edges. A man with a large farmhouse and steady conversation, someone sturdy enough to survive the frontier, yet civilized enough to understand her. The photograph Samuel had mailed months earlier had not helped much. The image was faded and small. He stood beside a fence with his hat pulled low, shoulders broad beneath a wool coat, serious-faced. Hard to read. Still, Eleanor had filled in the missing pieces herself. Lonely people often do. The train whistle echoed through the mountains as the conductor announced Helena Junction. Eleanor gathered her coat tighter around herself, while passengers began stepping into the narrow aisle. Her heart beat harder with every movement of the train. She was not arriving for a visit. She was arriving for a marriage. That truth settled heavily inside her chest. At 29 years old, Eleanor understood what people whispered behind her back in Boston. Too educated, too opinionated, too quiet for men who wanted cheerful wives with easy smiles and soft agreement. After her father died, and debts so swallowed the family home, she had become something uncomfortable in polite society. A woman without protection, without fortune, without direction. And so when Samuel's advertisement appeared in the newspaper through the church correspondence office, she answered, not because she believed in romance, but because she was tired of being unnecessary everywhere she went. The train finally stopped with a violent hiss of steam. Cold air rushed inside the moment the doors opened. Eleanor stepped down carefully onto the snow-covered platform, clutching the handle of her suitcase while wind clawed at her dark blue coat. Men moved crates nearby. Horses snorted clouds into the freezing air. Somewhere farther down the tracks, someone shouted over the storm wind. Then she saw him. Samuel Reed stood near the edge of the platform, beside a weathered wagon half covered in snow. And immediately she knew this was not a gentleman farmer. He was taller than she expected, wider in the shoulders. His coat looked old enough to have survived several winters. Too many, and his gloves were cracked from hard labor. Snow rested along the brim of his hat, while rough stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that unsettled her most. Not cruel, not cold, just tired. The kind of tired that settled deep into a person after years of carrying grief alone. Samuel looked at her quietly for several seconds before stepping forward. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low and rough from disuse, not unfriendly, just unused to conversation. Eleanor nodded carefully. Mr. Reed. That was all. No smile, no warm greeting, only the wind moving between them. Samuel reached for her suitcase automatically, and Eleanor noticed immediately how large his hands were, red from winter, scarred across the knuckles. The hands of a man who repaired his own fences, chopped his own wood, buried his own dead. He lifted the suitcase easily, then paused. Books. Too many books. He could hear them shifting heavily inside. Samuel glanced once toward Eleanor. Small woman, fine posture, clean gloves, city boots already ruined by snow. She looked nothing like the sturdy frontier wives he saw around town, carrying water buckets through blizzards or gutting chickens before dawn. A quiet disappointment moved through him before he could stop it. The photograph she had mailed months ago showed a composed woman beside a piano. He had assumed that meant refinement. Certainly, but also competence. A woman capable of bringing warmth back into a house that had gone cold years ago. He had not ordered a servant. He knew that. But somewhere deep inside himself, Samuel had hoped for someone who could stand inside a kitchen without looking frightened of the stove. Instead, the woman before him looked as if winter itself might break her. Still, he took her suitcase to the wagon without complaint. Because Samuel Reed was not a man who walked away from promises, the ride to the farm took nearly an hour through falling snow. The wagon wheels groaned over frozen roads while Eleanor sat beside him, beneath thick blankets, trying to hide the fact that she was shivering. Samuel noticed anyway. Without a word, he pulled the heavier blanket from his own lap and placed it over hers, then returned both hands to the reins. No explanation, no dramatic gesture, just quiet attention. Eleanor studied him from the corner of her eye as horses moved steadily through the storm. His silence should have felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt sad. There was a difference. She tried twice to begin conversation. "You've lived in Montana long." "Since '72. After several more minutes, she asked softly, "Do you like it here?" Samuel looked towards the snowy hills ahead of them. "Yes," nothing more. But the way he said it made Eleanor realize something important. He belonged to this land in a way she never could. The cabin finally appeared through the storm. Near dusk, a single lantern glowed beside the porch, while smoke curled from the chimney into the pale evening sky. The house sat alone against endless white fields, bordered by pine trees dark as charcoal. No neighboring homes nearby. No town lights, only silence. Deep and endless. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon slowly, boots sinking into snow. Samuel carried her suitcase onto the porch before opening the door for her. Warmth greeted them immediately. Wood smoke, coffee, old pine floors. The cabin was small but clean. A worn rug rested near the stove. Shelves lined one wall filled with jars and tools. A heavy wool coat hung beside the door, and near the fireplace sat a tiny wooden chair, child-sized. Eleanor's eyes lingered there. Samuel noticed. "My daughters," he said quietly. The words landed heavily between them. Eleanor looked away at once. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. That was all. But the room changed after that. Now she understood the silence. It was not emptiness. It was absence. Samuel showed her the small bedroom near the back of the cabin. The bed was neatly prepared with fresh blankets. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar beside the window long after they should have existed in winter, dried carefully, saved from warmer months. Eleanor touched them gently, while Samuel stood awkwardly near the doorway. "You can rest," he said. "Supper's usually around 6. Usually." The word caught her attention. Not tonight. Usually. Because until now, Samuel had eaten alone. After he left, Eleanor sat quietly on the edge of the bed, listening to the cabin breathe around her. Wind pressed softly against the walls. Floorboards creaked somewhere in the other room. The stove crackled steadily. For the first time since leaving Boston, fear truly settled into her chest. Not fear of Samuel, fear of failing here. The supper disaster began almost immediately. Eleanor had insisted on cooking. Samuel hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. He should have known better. Within 20 minutes, smoke filled half the cabin. The biscuits burned black along the bottoms, while coffee boiled over the stove and splattered across the ironed surface with angry hissing sounds. Eleanor coughed while trying desperately to wave smoke toward the open window. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Back east, servants and boarding kitchens had hidden her shortcomings well enough. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. Samuel entered quietly from outside, carrying extra firewood under one arm. He stopped, looked at the smoke, looked at Eleanor. Neither spoke. Eleanor wanted him to laugh almost, or complain. Anything would have hurt less than his silence. "I can make something else," she said quickly. Samuel crossed the room, set down the wood, then removed the ruined pan from the stove with calm efficiency. "It's all right." "It clearly isn't." He glanced toward her briefly. "I've eaten worse," which somehow made her feel even more ashamed. They ate burnt biscuits and overcooked beans in near silence beside the fire, while snow battered the windows outside. Eleanor barely touched her food. Samuel noticed that too. Later that night, after Eleanor retreated quietly to her room, Samuel remained awake in the kitchen, staring into the dying fire. This had been a mistake. Not because she was cruel, not because she complained, but because she did not belong here. He could already see it. The way she hesitated before touching rough wood surfaces, the careful way she folded clothing, the uncertainty around every frontier task. A woman like Eleanor Whitmore deserved lamps and music and proper floors, not frozen water buckets before sunrise, not cattle sickness and endless winters. Samuel rubbed tired fingers across his eyes. He should never have answered her letter. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone on the opposite side of the thin cabin wall, listening to the wind outside, and cried quietly into her blanket where no one could hear. The next morning she woke before dawn to strange sounds outside her door. For one confused moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell reached her. Hot water. Eleanor opened the door carefully. A steaming bucket rested on the floorboards beside a folded towel. No note, no explanation, just warm water before sunrise. Samuel was already outside, feeding horses in the snow. Eleanor stood there, staring at the bucket longer than she meant to. That afternoon, she attempted bread again. The result was only slightly less terrible. Samuel ate 2 slices anyway. By the third morning, Eleanor noticed fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly beside the kitchen door before she even woke. Every peepage measured evenly, dry, ready for the stove. Samuel never mentioned bringing it, and Eleanor never thanked him aloud, but she stopped feeling entirely unwelcome after that. Days passed slowly beneath heavy winter skies. The rhythm of frontier life settled around them, one quiet task at a time. Samuel rose before dawn each morning to tend livestock, while Eleanor learned how to keep fires alive through the coldest hours. She burned meals less often now, burned herself more frequently instead. Once she dropped an entire basket of potatoes into the snow outside the barn. While carrying supplies, the potatoes rolled everywhere across the frozen ground. Eleanor nearly burst into tears from frustration, but Samuel simply crouched beside her in silence and began gathering them one by one with his large gloved hands. "Ground's too frozen to waste food," he said. That was the longest sentence he had spoken all week. Somehow it made Eleanor smile despite herself. That night, while Samuel repaired harness straps beside the fire, Eleanor noticed one shelf in the cabin sagging badly beneath the weight of books she had unpacked. The next morning, the shelf had been repaired before she woke. Stronger than before, no comment from Samuel, only the shelf. Little by little, they began speaking through actions instead of words. Eleanor left coffee warming on the stove. When Samuel returned late from town, Samuel patched the draft beneath her bedroom window. After hearing her cough during the night, Eleanor mended a tear in his coat sleeve. While he slept beside the fire one evening, Samuel pretended not to notice when he wore the coat the next morning. Snow continued falling across Montana. And inside the little cabin, something softer than love began quietly taking shape. By February, the storms grew meaner. Wind came screaming across the plains hard enough to shake the cabin walls through the night, and the world outside disappeared beneath layers of white, so deep even the fence posts looked buried alive. Samuel had lived through enough Montana winters to understand what silence like that meant. Danger, the kind that arrived slowly. A broken fence, a sick horse, a frozen water line, one mistake made after sundown. And yet for the first time in years, he no longer walked into that danger entirely alone. Eleanor had changed in ways neither of them spoke about aloud. Her city gloves had long since been replaced by rougher wool. She no longer hesitated before carrying wood. Her bread still leaned a little too dense, but now the cabin smelled warm in the evenings instead of burnt. More than once, Samuel had returned from the barn to find her asleep in the chair beside the fire, with a book resting open against her chest, and supper still warming on the stove for him. Waiting. No one had waited for him in a very long time. One evening near the end of February, snow began falling before dusk. By midnight, it had become a blizzard. The wind screamed around the cabin so violently, the windows rattled in their frames, while snow piled halfway up the porch rails. Samuel had just banked the fire lower when he heard the sound from outside, a distressed bawling from the barn. He stood immediately. "One of the cows," he muttered, already reaching for his coat. Eleanor rose from the table at once. "What is it?" "She's calving." The wind hit hard the moment Samuel opened the door. Snow swirled through darkness, thick as smoke, while the lantern light shook violently in his hand. "I'll come with you," Eleanor said. "No, you can't do it alone in this weather." Samuel turned toward her sharply. "You'll freeze." But Eleanor was already pulling on her coat. The barn stood nearly invisible beneath the storm, its roof groaning under heavy snow, while frightened cattle shifted restlessly inside. Warm animal breath filled the air in pale clouds as Samuel knelt beside the struggling cow. "She's stuck," he said grimly. Eleanor held the lantern higher, while snow melted into her hair and gloves. The cow cried again, trembling violently. Hours seemed to pass inside that freezing barn. Samuel worked carefully, calmly, speaking softly to the frightened animal, while Eleanor stayed beside him, despite the cold cutting through her bones. More than once her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the lantern, but she never left. Finally, just before dawn, the calf slipped free onto the hay, alive, small, shivering, breathing. Samuel let out a long breath he did not realize he'd been holding. For one exhausted moment, he closed his eyes. Then he looked toward Eleanor. She was pale, too pale. Snow clung to her coat, and her lips had lost nearly all color. "Eleanor," she tried to answer, but nearly collapsed instead. Samuel caught her before she hit the ground. The ride back to the cabin blurred strangely for Eleanor afterward. She remembered fragments only. Samuel carrying her through the storm, the fire roaring louder than usual, blankets wrapped tightly around her, the rough warmth of his hands trying to bring feeling back into hers. Fever came before morning. Samuel stayed beside the bed through the entire night, while wind battered the cabin walls outside. He changed cool cloths against her forehead, forced water between her lips, fed the stove every hour to keep the room warm enough. He did not sleep. Around dawn, Eleanor drifted half awake to the sound of his voice beside her, quiet, worn thin with exhaustion. "I couldn't lose another one." The words barely reached above a whisper, but they settled deeply into the room. Eleanor opened her eyes slightly. Samuel did not know she was awake. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she understood fully what lived beneath his silence. Not coldness, fear. A man who had once loved deeply enough to be destroyed by loss. When Eleanor's fever finally broke late the next day, she found Samuel asleep in the chair beside the bed, one arm hanging heavily at his side, while snowlight filtered softly through the curtains. His face looked older in sleep, lonelier. Eleanor studied him quietly for a long moment, before pulling the blanket higher around his shoulders, so he would not wake cold. That evening, Samuel attempted to cook. The result was terrible. The porridge held far too much salt, and somehow he managed to burn bacon while undercooking potatoes at the same time. Eleanor ate every bite anyway. Halfway through supper, she laughed softly. For the first time since coming west, a real laugh, not polite, not careful. Samuel looked up from his bowl. The sound startled him more than the storm had. "You don't have to pretend it's good," he said. "It's awful." He almost smiled then. Almost. That was all. That was everything. After the blizzard, something shifted between them. Not suddenly. Nothing about Samuel Reed happened suddenly. But the distance inside the cabin began disappearing one quiet gesture at a time. Samuel started clearing snow from the porch before Eleanor woke each morning, because he noticed she slipped once carrying water. A week later, Eleanor discovered nails hammered carefully beneath the porch steps for better footing during ice. No mention of it. No need. Every month, Samuel traveled into town for supplies. Now he returned with books tucked awkwardly beneath his arm, because he had once noticed Eleanor staring too long at the tiny shelf inside the general store. History books, poetry, a worn novel missing its front cover. "You remembered," she said softly the first time. Samuel shrugged while removing his gloves. "You read fast." That night, Eleanor sat beside the fire, reading aloud, while Samuel repaired harness leather nearby. At first she thought he wasn't listening. Then halfway through one chapter he quietly said, "Go back. You skipped a line. After that?" She always read slower. The routines deepened. Eleanor learned exactly how Samuel liked his coffee. Strong, nearly bitter. Samuel learned Eleanor hummed softly while baking when she believed nobody could hear. Every evening she waited supper for him, no matter how late chores kept him outside. Every morning he filled the wood box before she touched the stove. Love entered the cabin quietly, like snowfall during the night. One afternoon in early spring, they traveled together into town for supplies. Snow still rested along the roadsides, though sunlight had finally begun softening the hills. Inside the general store, Eleanor moved between shelves, gathering flour and coffee, while Samuel spoke briefly with the owner near the counter. An older woman nearby smiled toward Eleanor. "You settling into married life all right?" Eleanor opened her mouth automatically. She almost explained, almost said they had never truly spoken vows in a church, that this arrangement had begun from loneliness more than romance. But before she could answer, Samuel spoke without looking up from the ledger book in his hands. Long enough. Simple words. Quiet words. Still, something warm moved through Eleanor so suddenly it nearly frightened her, because for the first time, Samuel sounded certain she belonged beside him, not temporary, not misplaced. Home. That night, the cabin felt different somehow, smaller perhaps, warmer. Eleanor darned one of Samuel's shirts beside the fire, while he carved wood quietly near the window. "What are you making?" she finally asked. Samuel hesitated, then handed the small carving across the room. A bird. Tiny, carefully shaped, smooth beneath her fingers. "For the shelf," he said. Eleanor looked at the little carving much longer than necessary. No one had made something for her since she was a girl. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel nodded once and returned to his chair. But later, after Eleanor had gone to bed, he looked toward the bookshelf and saw the wooden bird placed carefully beside her favorite novels. And for reasons he could not entirely explain, the sight stayed with him long after the fire burned low. Spring arrived slowly across Montana territory. Snow melted from the fields in patches, while muddy roads reappeared beneath the thaw. Eleanor planted small flowers beside the porch, even though Samuel quietly warned her the late frost might kill them. She planted them anyway. A week later, Samuel built a wooden frame around the flower bed to protect it from wandering cattle. No discussion, just the frame waiting there one morning. The cabin no longer echoed the way it once had. Now there were 2 cups drying beside the sink, 2 shadows near the fire at night, 2 voices moving softly through the same rooms. One evening near sunset, Samuel entered the house carrying folded papers from town. Eleanor looked up from the stove. "What's that?" Samuel removed his hat slowly, then placed the papers gently on the table before her. Land documents, the property deed. Eleanor frowned in confusion until she saw her name written beside his. Her breath caught. "Samuel." He shifted awkwardly, suddenly uncomfortable beneath her gaze. "You should have a home that stays." That was all he said. No speech, no grand declaration. Just those quiet words spoken by a man who had once lost everything and now wanted desperately to give someone permanence. Eleanor covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes, because no one had ever offered her safety before. Not truly. Samuel looked almost alarmed by her crying. "Did I do something wrong?" She laughed softly through tears and shook her head. "No." Then, after a long silence, she whispered, "You did everything right." Years later, people in town would say Samuel Reed became softer after Eleanor Whitmore arrived. But that wasn't true. He had always been gentle. Grief had simply buried it beneath silence. And Eleanor had not changed the frontier either. Winters still came hard. Cattle still wandered. Wind still rattled the cabin windows after dark. But somehow the cold no longer reached quite as far inside that little house. Children came eventually. Then laughter. Then new chairs beside the fire. Then more bookshelves. Time moved the way it always does. Quietly. Samuel's hair silvered. Eleanor's hands grew lined from years of work. The porch creaked older beneath their footsteps. But every winter morning before sunrise, Samuel still carried fresh-cut firewood to the kitchen door. Every single morning, long after he no longer needed to prove his love. Because that was how he loved her. Not through speeches, through repetition, through presence, through small, faithful things done over and over, until they became part of the walls themselves. He never became the gentleman farmer Eleanor once imagined, and she never became the woman who could truly cook. But somewhere between burnt bread, winter storms, books beside the fire, and the soft sound of boots returning home through snow, they became home to each other. If this story stayed with you, tell me, when do you think Samuel first realized he loved her? And if you want another frontier love story about 2 lonely souls finding warmth in a cold world, there's another story waiting right here